Now that we've got Skeleton downloaded and installed into our project, it's time for us to start using it to make our website responsive. One of the first things we're going to want to do though, before we do that, is to do a little bit of what we would call code refactoring. And what that means is we just want to go through and remove some of the things that are in place to do things that Skeleton will now be able to do for us, mostly to do with layout things. So one of the things we want to do is come visit our style sheet here, and probably the main one that we're going to want to take care of is this display of flex property that's on nav UL, because that's going to break a lot of things that Skeleton is intended to do for us. And now normally I would tell you to delete these, because if you were doing a production site, you would want to make sure that your file size was as small as possible, and deleting lines of code can help with that. But since this is for a project that I'm going to be looking over for you, I want you to comment them out instead so that I can see that you had them and that you commented them out. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through this section and we're going to look for things that are to do with layout, and mostly that's things that are to do with width or height, especially width. So some of the height things we might need, but for the width, we want to get rid of all of them. So right here, this width of 20% that we were using to space these buttons across the top, we're going to get rid of that. And then I don't think we even need this. I don't think it's really doing anything for us, but we can try and see. Let's comment it out and see. And then here, the header nav having this height of 40 pixels. So that's working great if we didn't want a responsive site, because it's keeping this nav bar to a specific height. But we want this nav bar to be stacked to where it's going to be 5 times as tall, to account for the height of each of the 5 buttons at 550 pixels or below. So let's comment that out for now. Line height we can keep. That's just centering the buttons. The footer nav's height of 50 pixels. We can actually keep this because we don't want those to stack. If you remember when we did our wireframe, we want those to stay aligned, so we can keep that way. But we do not need this 6.6 or 16.66% anymore, so we can comment that out. And the height of 100% will be okay for those. I think that's mostly it. Okay, so one thing we can get rid of here is this max width of 960 and this margin of 0 and auto that we've put on main. And the reason for that is that Skeleton has a class called container that applies these 2 properties. So we don't need this anymore. Comment both of those out. And I think that that's all we're going to need. Let's save this and check it out in the browser. It's going to look worse before it looks better, so be prepared for that. Okay, and now we kind of get a better sense of what it's going to look like on a responsive size. So if we have a more narrow screen, this will be okay. And this we're going to want to fix at a more narrow screen. But we're going to use Skeleton to put all of those things in place instead. Now, one thing we are going to need from Skeleton that I overlooked before, so what you may want to do is go back to your Skeleton package. I know I deleted mine, so I had to go pull the zip file out of my trash and open it up to get to this Skeleton style sheet here. And there was one utility down here that we're going to need so that it doesn't break things. So if we come all the way down here, under utilities, under miscellaneous, this clearing section here, it's just one declaration, but it makes sure that everything lines up properly and that the flow of content is correct. So we're going to copy this clearing section out of the original Skeleton style sheet, and I'm going to go put that back into my Skeleton style sheet beneath all of the grid. So if you remember, we took out everything but the grid, but now we're going to add the self-clearing properties back. I'm going to save that. And when I reload, I shouldn't see much of a change on my page yet. So now it's time for me to use Skeleton to create my layout instead of the things that I was doing to try to create it from scratch. I'm going to start with the container class. So if I come back to my code here, what I really want is to have my main element, I still want it centered like it was with that max width of 960 and the margins of auto on either side. But I can do that using Skeleton by giving it a class equal to container. And let me show you what that does real quickly. Most all frameworks have this container class, and it pretty much is always called that. It pretty much always does the same thing. So you should look for it. But you can see what it does here is to snap these into place. Now, the other thing I'd really like to do, in my previous version, my navigation button stretched all the way to the edge of the browser. I'd actually kind of like that navigation bar to line up right here. But I would also like the color to extend all the way to the edge. So obviously, if I were to give header this class of container, it would actually stop right here, and all the color would stop right here too. Let me show you very quickly how that would look. So this is not something that we want to do, so I want you to just watch this, but don't do it. So if I came back, just like I had given main that class of container, if I came back and I gave header the same class, you see I lose all my color that goes to the edge, and I'd actually like for the color to extend to the edge, but I would like for the navigation bar to only extend to the edge of the container here. So what I need to do is, instead of giving that class of container to the header, I need to give it to the nav bar. That way my color, my background color, is already applied to header. And if I apply the class of container to the nav bar, it centers everything here, but the color goes all the way to the edge, with the exception of this button. So obviously that's something that we'll want to fix. But this is more for when it's on a desktop layout that we're going to want to have that. So let's move to the, since we're working with HTML, let's move back to Sublime Text and do some of these changes. So it's easier to do design in browser with CSS than it is with HTML. And what I'm going to do is just copy this class of container that I applied to main, and I'm going to apply that to both nav elements on header and footer. I accidentally copied my nav element instead, so I'm just going to type it out. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to give that to the footer nav as well. Okay, so again, we're not going to see a whole lot of progress yet with just those three classes, but we're starting to get there. Now, one thing you may notice that might be bothering you as well is that we had given our main element some padding all the way around to keep this text off of the edge. And when we applied the class of container to the main element, that went away. Let me talk to you a little bit about that. So when I come here, main with class of container, if we look in the styles panel of the developer tools, we can see the order in which the styles are being applied. And anything with a strike through means it's being overridden by something higher up in this list. So in this case, we can see this width of 85% is being overridden to a width of 80%, and it's to do with how wide the screen is right now. If I change that, those two will switch places at a point. So anyway, moving down here, we can see that Skeleton's class of container is applying that max width that we wanted and the margins of 0 and auto, which is why we commented them out of our style for main. However, it's also removing our padding. You see the strike through on the padding in styles.css for the main element of 2rem. Well, the class of container in Skeleton has set all padding to 0 at this particular size. And so that's causing some of this problem for us. And if we want to have that back, all we really need to do is just be a little bit more specific with this selector. So the way that CSS specificity works is that a class has higher priority than a tag. So that's the reason why we want to style tags as much as possible, because that way if we need to override something, we could do it with a class. And you really want to be only as specific as you need to be, but in this case we need to be a little bit more specific so that our padding is applied to this rather than the padding of the container element within Skeleton. Now also, we still want our containers for our navigation bars to probably follow Skeleton styles. It's just this one that we want a little bit of padding to push the text off of the edge. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to return to working in browser for just a minute for my style sheets. And I'm going to come to styles.css. I'm going to come find that main element. And I'm going to be just a little bit more specific. So this time, rather than trying to override all containers and give padding to all containers, I just want to give padding to the container that is applied to main, right? So all I have to do for that is call out main with a class of container. The way that I do that is with no spaces in between the word main and the class name. I type out main dot container. And so when there's no space, that means a main element with a class of container. If I put a space in between, that means something inside the main element, a child of the main element with a class of container. So that one little space makes a huge difference. But if I add this back, I get my background color and my padding back without any issues and without having to mess with skeleton style sheet. And I really don't want to modify skeleton style sheet any more than I already have. Okay, so now we can start to see how that's working. We're not quite done yet though. So in skeleton's documentation, it's kind of buried here in a comment, but right under the grid, if you look in the comments here, some of the documentation is actually listed in the comments that explain how to use it. And here, this one note is really important. It says that columns should be the immediate child of a row. So what that means is anytime I want to break something up into a column-based layout, which is going to be everything on the page if I'm using skeleton for my framework, that I need to wrap those in a row div and wrap all the columns that will add up together basically to 12. In a row together. So what I want to do next is, let's do that with the main element because it's the easiest. The main element should really just be a one column layout right now. So all I need to do to achieve that is to create a new div. Div is just a generic container in HTML, by the way. You just use this when there's not a more specific element name for it. And I'm going to call it div with a class of row. And I'm going to wrap that row div around all of my content in my main element. Get rid of those. And I'm also going to make sure that I tab in my my content a little bit further. Right now I've got mine 2 tabs in. You could do that as well. That was from some previous troubleshooting I was doing outside of the video. But what I want to do is add a row div right here. And then I'm going to close that just before the main element closes. And then I can add another div that provides the columns. So I need one more div with 2 classes this time. And remember that we can only have one class attribute on an element. So this div can only have this class equals and the quotes once. But inside the quotes, we can call out more than one class to apply more than one. In this case, I need to apply 2 classes to span to a single column layout. I need to span all 12 columns of my grid. So I need a class or 2 classes of 12. And the second class is columns in skeleton. And then I need to make sure that I close that at the bottom of my content. Now, one thing I recommend you do as you start adding skeleton into your work here is to consider every time you see more than one closing div tag, you probably want to put a comment next to it that explains what it's closing. I usually type these in manually because if I were to type it out like I've been doing and select the text, if I want it on the same line, it comments out the closing tag as well. I'll show you that on this second one, but sometimes it's easier just to type it in manually. And I tend to use as shorthand the same kind of shorthand that HTML tags use for closing with that slash. So I'm just going to type in /div.12.columns as my comment. And all that's saying is this closes the div with the classes of 12 and columns. And you saw that that was a little bit of work. So if I wanted to do it in the other way I've been doing it, I could type just /div.row. But notice, even though I'm just selecting this text, when I go to comment it out, it comments out the whole line. And that could cause some errors in my display. So I need to remember to cut the opening part of that comment out and paste it behind the closing tag so that it doesn't comment any of my actual code out. Either way is fine. Neither one's that convenient, but you're going to really appreciate having these as you get a deeper nesting structure using this. So let's take a look at what we've got here. If we come back, looks like I might have broken something by fixing something else. Let's see what I did. Let me take my elements here. I've got my div with my class of row and my div with my class of 12 columns. And the only thing I'm not getting anymore is my padding. And it looks like Something is just overriding that padding in here, and it might be the columns actually. Let's see. I don't see anything there that's resetting the padding. Let's check the row. No, you know what I did? I forgot to save my style sheet from doing my design in browser. I bet that's it. I need to give my main element in my actual style sheet this class of container, and that'll probably fix it. Let's see. Yeah, that took care of it. So now we're a lot closer. So next we'll do a pass, and we'll take a look at the navigation bar and the footer if we have time as well.